We can all sense your frustration with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Do you think he has been lying to you about his intentions in Ukraine?
Well, I don't want to use the word lying. All I know is we'd have a good talk, and it seemed on, let's say, 3 occasions, it seemed that we were going to have a ceasefire and maybe peace, and you divide it up and you do whatever you have to do, that obviously to get to the end. And all of a sudden, missiles are flying into Kyiv. You know, this has happened on too many occasions, and I don't like it. I don't like it.
It's like the mere political objective of mocking Trump's repeated attempts of trying to accelerate an end to the war, and in a way frustrating Trump. And this is quite Russia's playbook 101, trying to dismiss any attempts at putting pressure on Russia, of trying to portray itself as the victim.
Jaroslava Barbieri, thank you very much for joining us today. I want to begin by asking you about Donald Trump's threat of sanctions. I mean, firstly, can you outline how these might work and how different they will be from the already existing targeted US sanctions on Russia?
We heard a few weeks ago Trump's threat to impose tariffs on existing trading partners of Russia, namely countries such as India, for example. And essentially, there would be a roundabout way to try and cut revenues to Russia's state coffers to continue the war effort. And so by increasing tariffs, essentially, it would make it more expensive for US consumers, say, to purchase goods from these countries. And so that is the roundabout way to cut revenues to the state coffers. Now, actually, there's a very recent news. It seems that Indian companies will pause now purchases from of Russian oil, and there is a piece of news that has emerged as a consequence of Trump's threat in response to the threatening tone of Medvedev, who's a former Russian president. And so we see that, in a way, this U-turn of the Trump administration in terms of pressuring Russia rather than Ukraine seems to be effective to some extent. But this is still early days. We still have to see whether he would be actually fulfilling his threats in a way.
I mean, these secondary sanctions certainly appear new to us. I don't think we've seen anything like this in the past. Do you know if that's the case? Are these new? Have these been administered in the past? And if so, have they been successful? It sounds like, obviously, in the case of India, as you mentioned, they seem to be bearing fruit.
So far, especially under the Biden administration, the type of sanctions we've seen have been targeting particular sectors of the Russian economy. Think about energy sector or the finance sectors. And then in parallel is very targeted sanctions against individuals that have been linked, have close ties with the Kremlin or sectors of the economy that are directly involved in the war effort. And so this would be a sort of evolution from the Trump administration, because so far Trump has essentially been renewing the sanctions regime that has been in place under Biden. So we are yet still to see whether Trump would be actually fulfilling that promise of essentially increasing the pressure on Russia rather than Ukraine, and therefore breaking its past policy pattern of a preferential treatment towards Russia.
Sure, and you mentioned this change in tack from Trump, obviously clear change of rhetoric. Pressure now seems to be piling on Russia. He reduced this 50-day deadline he mentioned a couple of weeks ago to just 10 to 12 days. And yet Russian strikes on Ukraine continue. Deadly strike overnight in Kyiv, at least 9 people dead, including children. Is Putin simply choosing to ignore Trump at this stage?
In a way, I think that today's strike on Ukraine's capital is a response to Trump's announcement that he would be cutting the deadline from 50 years to 10 to 12 days, as he said. And this is only one of the objectives, I would say, of this attack. It's like the mere political objective of mocking Trump's repeated attempts of trying to accelerate an end to the war, and in a way frustrating Trump. So that fits a quite consistent pattern of Russian attacks, of Russia trying to keep pushing the red lines of what's acceptable and getting away with its crimes and its violation of international law. But also there's, like a very immediate objective of trying to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses, and so trying to at least get some missiles through. And so this is a key military immediate objective of this type of combined attacks, where you have drones combined with cruise missiles. We've seen an entire apartment block collapse during this attack. And then finally, there's this very consistent objective of demoralizing Ukraine's civilian population that have to go through these sleepless nights and then go on with their day-to-day lives. And so through this physical and mental exhaustion, trying to break that spirit of defiance, that willingness to continue to resist.
It really does seem like Putin isn't so threatened by Trump's threat of sanctions. You mentioned as well this, latest strike in part could be a form of mocking what Trump is suggesting here. Do you think Vladimir Putin is right to think the Russian economy can withstand new sanctions?
So this is a tricky question, because this is what the Russian state authorities are declaring. They need to project this image of invincibility, not showing that they're vulnerable to the growing pressure from Ukraine's Western partners that are trying to tighten the screws on the Russia's economy. So we definitely know that sanctions are being effective in making it harder for Russia to wage the war, but they're not going far enough to constrain Russia altogether. So over 3 years into the war, we know that the Russian economy has adjusted, has found roundabout way to circumvent international sanctions. And for example, when it comes to finding new markets for its oil export, we've seen that sort of they've moved to countries such as China and India. But nonetheless, we do know that the Russian economy is suffering with, growing inflationary pressures, with growing interest rates. So the impact is being felt by the broader civilian population. But of course, in a war economy, if you are someone that is working within Russia's defense sector, you're actually benefiting from this changed economic structure. So it's a tricky question, but you could say that Russia has managed to find a way to adjust to sanction, and that in a way it feels it cannot afford to show any sign of weakness. And so we've heard even the statement from the Kremlin spokesperson that Russia has managed to adjust, and whatever threats will come from the White House, they won't really move the needle.
It's really interesting. I mean, realistically, though, what options do you think President Trump has if Putin refuses to play ball and meet his deadline?
I think that something that is encouraging is seeing this potential change of heart in the Trump administration, because so far we've seen a continuation of a recurrent fallacy that we've seen in Western governments, especially in the pre-2022 period, which was to put pressure on Ukraine to make political, territorial concessions and ending the war on Russian terms. And now it seems that Trump is being increasingly irritated with Putin's intransigent position. We're still yet to see whether he will continue to apply pressure on Russia and really exercise to its full extent the pressure that the US could exercise. So we're still yet to see This is quite new, this U-turn. We need to see whether he'll manage to really, really exercise pressure on Moscow. So Moscow has learned to adjust to this unpredictability, but in a way it cannot change its strategy. It has to continue push further and not step back from its maximalist objective towards Ukraine because it's gone too far. Now the Kremlin feels has no option but to continue to pursue its maximalist objectives. And to be fair, so far Russia has not been punished sufficiently for continuing to push the line further, and that is a pattern that we've seen predating the 2022 full-scale invasion.
For sure, and I want to hone in on that point. I mean, you've mentioned yourself that Russia is quite resilient when it comes to sort of working its way around sanctions. So even if Donald Trump is to bring in another layer of sanctions, do you think that's enough? I mean, realistically, brainstorm here for us. What are the other tools at Donald Trump's disposal? What else can they do to sort of bring Putin in line with their objectives?
I do think that since the full-scale invasion, we've already seen that European countries have drastically reduced their dependence on Russian hydrocarbons, particularly gas, but Russia has managed to continue relying on oil exports to fund its war machine. So if the US, in cooperation with European and non-European countries, will manage to really reduce Russia's ability to export oil to alternative markets and really put an oil cap that really could put a dent on Russia's ability to continue and wage the war effort. So if you talk to economists and sanction specialists, they say that that is the most promising avenue to pursue to really try and squeeze the Russian economy and its ability to continue its war against Ukraine.
Okay, well, look, Trump has previously said he's willing to walk away from the whole thing. I mean, what would the consequences be for Ukraine if he does do that?
So, I mean, it seems like Trump has experiment with all the possible approaches, right? It has tried to put pressure on Ukraine. It has threatened to walk away and leave Europe to deal with it on its own. And now it seems to be putting pressure on Russia. Realistically, when we talk about the possibility of sitting at a table of negotiations to implement a ceasefire agreement, everyone believes that it shouldn't be a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Trump. It should have the presence of key European leaders and preferably also the US, because it is an actor that still Russia feels threatened by. It's also a status question that Russia thinks of itself on a par with the United States. And so the Europeans are preparing for the possibility of having to make it alone, both in terms of security and diplomacy, but nonetheless, we haven't reached that stage yet. And you can see that European leaders are trying to carefully keep Trump on board precisely because of that logic that the presence of the US still has a very important deterrent, including nuclear deterrent, vis-a-vis Russia.
I think it's quite interesting that you mentioned Trump appears to have tried sort of every strategy, as it were. But to what degree do you think Putin's apparent inaction here is in part due to Trump himself? I mean, who can forget the initial rhetoric against Ukraine and that famous bust-up between Zelensky and the White House? There's also reports earlier this month that the delivery of some military equipment to Ukraine was paused, citing Pentagon concerns that US stockpiles were dwindling too low. I mean, do you think Putin is taking Trump seriously?
This is a tricky question. It reminds me of a statement from the kind of veteran Russian foreign minister Lavrov, who actually ridiculed Trump's attempt a few weeks ago by claiming, well, first it will take only 24 hours and then a few months and then 50 days and now 10 days. So this constant changing position is certainly not signaling, not projecting strength from Russia's perspective. But again, this is quite Russia's playbook 101, trying to dismiss any attempts at putting pressure on Russia, of trying to portray itself as the victim, as the party that is on the right side of history. So they will try to spin the narrative however they can, whatever comes from the US administration. So on the one hand, yes, they have learned to play Trump well, to play to his ego, but on the other hand, they can quickly spin the narrative. It's Trump suddenly looks no longer like a potential ally, or at least Russia sympathizer.
Jaroslava Barbieri, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.